With Borderlands 3's and Wonderlands DLC cycles done and out of the way for the foreseeable future, I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that Gearbox has already started work on Borderlands 4. However, with how poorly Wonderlands was received by a majority of the community, a lot of fans of previous Borderlands games are going to be really hesitant when it comes to purchasing the next Borderlands game. Whether it's called Borderlands 4 or Borderlands the post-sequel, Gearbox needs to get this game absolutely perfect if they have any hopes of redeeming themselves for the poor launch of Borderlands 3 and Wonderlands. So I asked the community what they would like to see from the next Borderlands game, and this is what they said. One of the most common responses I got, and probably the most predictable thing that's on this list, is a great story. Borderlands 2's story was absolutely phenomenal, and so was the pre-sequels. But Gearbox really dropped the ball when it came to writing Borderlands 3's story. The villains were whiny and poorly written, and a lot of the plot points either disappear completely or are just forgotten about by the end of the game. Borderlands 3's story is, at best, mediocre, maybe a little bit better than the original Borderlands, but it didn't do anything to really keep focus or make us want to replay the game. Luckily, Gearbox has shown that they haven't completely lost it, as Wonderland's story was absolutely incredible. If Borderlands 4 is going to be great, it needs an amazing story. Not only did the pre-sequel have a really good story, but it also had really good player-to-NPC conversation. This was a personal touch that was introduced to Borderlands with the pre-sequel, but it didn't really return to its full glory in Borderlands 3. The playable Vault Hunters seemed like they were almost having a conversation with the story characters as you played in the pre-sequel. This was a really unexpected, but really awesome feature in the pre-sequel. Borderlands 3's playable character still had dialogue at certain points, but it wasn't as great as in the pre-sequel. Borderlands 4 needs to bring back the really natural, really good playable character dialogue. Borderlands 3 brought so many quality of life changes to the series, from selling all junk with a single button to being able to fast travel from literally anywhere. The multitude of quality of life changes is what made Borderlands 3 so good, and it makes Borderlands 2 or the pre-sequel really hard to go back to without missing all of these changes. However, there are still a lot of quality life improvements that can be made to Borderlands, such as selling all non-favorite items with a button press or marking items as junk when you pick them up, being able to fast travel from a vehicle, and sorting your inventory by newest items first. There are a lot more, but that's just a few off the top of my head. The weapon proficiency system in the original Borderlands is honestly one of my favorite parts about that game. It made using only a specific weapon type feel actually rewarding. There was so much satisfaction in not only leveling up your character, but also leveling up your weapon proficiencies, and making your character the most powerful assault rifle user they can be. Unfortunately, this system has been absent from every game since then, and I can't help but feel like it's definitely something that needs to come back in Borderlands 4. Something that I thought I would never say about the Borderlands franchise is that it currently has too much RNG. The RNG from Borderlands 2 to 3 to Wonderlands has increased substantially. Getting the perfect rare drop in Borderlands 2 was rare, but not impossible. In Borderlands 3, a perfect rare drop is super difficult and could potentially take thousands of runs. And in Wonderlands, finding a perfect anything is just stupid rare. Don't get me wrong, I like farming for stuff, and even some super rare farms are fun, but I shouldn't need to take a week off work every single time I want to farm a new item. The odds of getting something to drop in Wonderlands are akin to winning the lottery. Farming anything in Borderlands 3 feels like farming a 94% sham, and farming anything in Wonderlands feels like farming a perfect hide of Terramorphous. Borderlands is about farming, and getting perfect gear for your build. But when farming takes 3 weeks per item, it's very hard to find a reason to want to farm the gear. I'm not saying every perfect drop should be a 1 in 3, but it certainly shouldn't be a 1 in 10,000 either. So please Gearbox, make farming realistic in Borderlands 4. Balance was a huge issue in Borderlands 3. Every other week, the entire meta seemed to change with constant buffs and nerfs. Especially after the launch of Mayhem 2.0, where 90% of the guns became completely unusable. The balance got so thrown off that repairing it seemed impossible. While a large portion of guns are now useful in Borderlands 3 again, an even larger portion of them are brokenly overpowered due to the reckless overbuffing. These balance issues are starting to happen again in Wonderlands, and it seems like the cycle is starting to repeat itself. To fix balance in Borderlands 3, Gearbox had to buff so many guns by so much, and that led to a lot of really bad power creep. So now certain weapons can be picked up at level 7 and carry you all the way through till level 35, which, while you can't avoid these weapons, a fair majority of the legendary weapons are like that in Borderlands 3, and that's where it becomes a problem. A lot of Wonderland's balance issues stem from the gimmicky weapons in that game, where the gun is designed more for a quick, haha, this gun shoots dice and that's it. They're not balanced for damage, and despite being mildly amusing for 3 seconds, they're completely useless otherwise. The balance issues in the entire Borderlands franchise can be summed up to 3 core problems: gimmicky weapons that don't do any damage, recklessly buffing weapons, and randomly jacking up enemy health and damage numbers. So Borderlands 4 needs to avoid all of these things if it wants to stay balanced and avoid every single person using the same 4 items. Matching elements was a super important part of Borderlands 2, especially come endgame. In Borderlands 3, it was kind of important, but with anointments we could literally deal 4 out of the 5 elements with a single weapon. In Wonderlands, elements almost don't matter at all. Using the correct element gives you at most 25% extra damage, and using the incorrect element only hurts you by about 20% on the damage front. Element matching was a huge part of what I found enjoyable in Borderlands, and it seems like that's kind of fading out with newer titles. Maybe this is just me though, I don't know, let me know in the comments down below if you feel the same way. Farming is Borderlands' main thing. It's what makes this game great. Without farming, Borderlands would just be a boring old shooter with next to no uniqueness. However, the method of farming has changed a lot throughout the years. In the original Borderlands game, we had a few dedicated sources for drops, but most of the legendary gear was acquired through world drops. Then when Borderlands 2 came around, it completely flipped the script, with almost every single item having a dedicated drop source, and only a few world drop items. The pre-sequel tried to go back to the original Borderlands' method, with most everything being world drops, but this was met with pretty poor review as we had gotten so accustomed to farming specific gear from a specific boss. Borderlands 3 again tried to do mostly world drop legendaries, and this time it was met with huge backlash. At the start of Borderlands 3's lifecycle, most of the named enemies didn't even respawn, and very few items actually had a dedicated drop source. Eventually the backlash got to be too much for Gearbox, and they ended up reworking Borderlands 3's drop system to be back like Borderlands 2's. They still clearly haven't learned their lesson yet though, because again, in Wonderlands, 70% of the named enemies don't respawn, and the only real way to farm anything is through world drops in the Chaos Chamber. Borderlands 4 needs to launch with respawning named enemies and an unbloated loot pool that actually feels rewarding to farm. Please stop trying to make world drops the main source of gear, it isn't fun. On a side note, the way that we've actually been farming named enemies is getting kind of outdated too. Having to save quit every single time we want to run a boss again is incredibly irritating. A couple of bosses in Borderlands 3 are farmable without save quitting at all, namely Freddy, Tom and Zam, and the Scrap Traps. Borderlands 4 needs to make named enemies farmable without having to save quit and go back into the game every single time. The Great War is something that was teased near the end of the pre-sequel. The Great War and the Watcher are both things that were pretty important in the pre-sequel that just vanished entirely afterwards. Nobody even talks about the Great War in Borderlands 3, and the Watcher is nowhere to be seen. Some people think that the Great War is the events of Borderlands 3, but I really don't think that's the case. A large part of the reason that Borderlands 3's story flopped so hard is because a lot of people left the pre-sequel expecting the next game to have some huge dramatic war going on, and it didn't. The Great War is something that I'm really looking forward to playing through and experiencing. This all kind of goes hand in hand with my first point about the story. The Great War would be an absolutely awesome thing to have Borderlands 4 be based around. Ever since they teased it in the pre-sequel, I've been so amped up thinking about the epic war we're supposed to be having, and I think it's about time we had it. Another big thing that Borderlands 4 really needs, more than possibly anything else, is an expansive, fun, and replayable endgame. Borderlands is a good series, and it has a pretty good story most of the time, but Borderlands as a game would be nothing without a good endgame. Borderlands 2 set a very large bar for endgame, one that Borderlands 3 definitely met by the end of its cycle. That's part of why Borderlands 2 and 3 are the most loved games of the franchise. Borderlands 1 had very little endgame aside from Carmarax, and the pre-sequel had literally no endgame. Here's where it gets tricky though, is Wonderlands has an endgame. And by the very definition of it, the Chaos Chambers are infinitely replayable. And while that is true, Chaos Chambers get so boring so quick. In Borderlands 3, if you didn't like the slaughter maps, you could go fight a raid boss instead. If you didn't like raid bosses, you could go play the trial maps. In Wonderlands, if you don't like the Chaos Chambers, oh well, too bad. The Chaos Chambers were a solid foundation for Wonderlands endgame, but that can't be the only thing to do. Borderlands 4 needs to have a variety of different endgame activities for us to do after we beat the story. Otherwise, we'll get bored really fast. There are a couple of small things that I think would be very nice for Borderlands 4, but are also pretty self-explanatory, like less visual pollution, less game-breaking, save-corrupting bugs, and not having skins drop after we unlock them. These are all things we've been asking for since Borderlands 2, so please Gearbox, do them. So that's what Borderlands 4 needs to be great. It's a huge checklist for Gearbox, but if they can pull it off, then Borderlands 4 will be the definitive best Borderlands game of them all. If there's anything you think I missed on this list, let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and have a fantastic day.